All right, welcome to one of the most important topics that we're going to cover this semester, and that is hydration, and particularly its effects on aerobic performance. So, if you look at sweating rates during like aerobic exercise, individuals can sweat anywhere from zero point 0.5 to 2 liters an hour. That's a lot of water. However, there's a disconnect between fluid loss and replace. So if you look here at this at basketball, what this is sweat rate, and this is fluid consumed. So in general, we see a disconnect again from sweat rate and fluid consumed. This is a problem, meaning you're going to have a net loss of total body water. But what does that mean? Well, there's a number of ways or a number of factors you have to take in consideration. First, you need to take in consideration the environment. If it's cold out, like in the winter, and you're going for a jog, you're going to have lower sweat requirements. If it's hot, especially in Florida, and humid in the summer and you're running, you'll have greater sweat requirements. So the need to hydrate is going to be dependent in part on the environment. One of the worst situations that you could be in for becoming prone to dehydration or hypohydration is being in a hot environment plus high insulation. Okay, a combination of hot environment and high insulation equals high heat stress, which results in a lot of sweating. Okay, so football players, playing in Texas, playing in Florida, things of that nature. So what's the threshold for decrements in performance? This is an aerobic step test by Yoshida, and what you notice is that anything greater than 2% dehydration, and you start to notice pretty drastic declines in performance. So that's very, very important. And in fact, you're seeing declines even at 1%. But the massive drop off down to like 20% declines in performance with as little as 2% dehydration. Whereas 1% dehydration, you're seeing like maybe 5% declines. So we say that threshold, that huge noticeable threshold, is greater than 2%. Now, why does this happen? What are the mechanisms? Well, first, if you have less total blood volume, you're going to have a decrease in cardiac output. Okay, and why is it the case? Well, you're going to have a decline in both stroke volume as well as blood flow to the working muscle. And that's what we see with this arrow here. Decreased stroke volume, decreased blood flow. However, to compensate, your body's going to increase heart rate, and yet even though your heart rate's increasing, your cardiac output is still lower. And cardiac output is if you look at what is VO2, VO2 is cardiac output times extraction of oxygen. If cardiac output lowers, you can't get your VO2 as high. Okay? And what I want you to see here is ratings of perceived exertion. That's ratings of perceived exertion in a 120-minute run there with no fluid, and that's ratings of perceived exertion with large amount of fluid. So we clearly see that as weight loss increases in the graph to the right, as weight loss increases, temperature actually ends up going up. And we think that that rise in temperature leads to an increase in perception of exertion. So again, as weight loss goes up, temperature goes up. As we talk about the environment, it's important to understand that whether you're dehydrated or not, or the impact of dehydration, will in large part be again impacted by the environment. So if you look at a cold environment, even if you're 3% dehydrated, performance only goes down a little. If you're in a normal temperature environment, performance goes down a lot. And that's the black part of the graph. One of the reasons why we think is that cold temperatures might shunt blood toward the core. And if you have greater core blood volume, you have greater cardiac output. So just remember, in hot environments, the impact of dehydration is going to be more noticeable. Again, that's cold temperature there, decrease in performance, and that's normal temperature. But it's not just fluid that we need to consider. We need to consider sodium and electrolytes. When plasma sodium gets essentially under 130 millimolars, you start to experience some symptoms of what we call hyponatremia. If plasma sodium gets to below 125 millimoles, you could have headache, vomiting, swollen hands and feet, restlessness, undue fatigue, confusion, disorientation, and wheezy breathing, which is due to pulmonary edema. If plasma sodium falls below this, like 120, you have chances for cerebral edema with a seizure, coma, brainstem herniation, and respiratory arrest, and yes, even death. So this is very serious that we need to take into consideration this hyponatremia issue. So what causes hyponatremia? Well, if it's in events less than 4 hours, it's essentially when you have lower sweat rate with excessive intake of fluid that has low sodium. Okay, so if you're exercising, you might have decreased blood flow to the kidneys and decreased urine output. But if you're consuming a large amount of, say, distilled water, then you're at risk. However, if you're doing ultra endurance, sodium losses can induce hyponatremia to levels associated with the onset of symptoms regardless of whether the individual is over or under drinking. So it's not just about that. So you basically need to replace both sodium and water. So one of the things to talk about is football seems to be a really, and this, by the way, this team's going to win the Super Bowl next year, the 49ers. Basically, you look, and exercise-associated hyponatremia occurs occasionally in American football players and tennis players who drink too much water to try and prevent quote-unquote heat cramps, or when a cramping player is given hypotonic fluid intravenously. So this does happen relatively frequently. So sodium's got to be replaced along with fluid. So in summary, there's a disconnect between fluid loss and replacement, and aerobic decrements are seen at low levels of dehydration, particularly in hot and humid environments. However, it is essential to replace both sodium and water so as to avoid dehydration and hyponatremia. I'll see you guys next time.